In its current state, Warside is not worth a purchase, despite a very promising framework. If that's all you need to know, you can feel free to leave now, but consider leaving a like and a sub before you go. However, if you want to know why I feel this way, watch on for my 100% review. My name is Tom, otherwise known as Titanium Legman, and welcome back to the channel. Hello everyone, if you enjoy what I do, including coverage and reviews of recently released strategy titles such as Warside, then again, a like on this video and a subscription to the channel would be very much appreciated. Thank you so much. Also, if you have any feedback about my reviews, the way I do them, the editing, the dialogue, anything like that, let me know in the comments. I'm getting into the groove of actually starting to do more videos like this, and I'm drawing a lot of inspiration from other creators, but if there's something that you in particular like to see in videos like this, do please let me know. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So what is Warside, you might be asking? Warside is essentially an Advance Wars clone, or a very heavily Advance Wars inspired turn-based strategy game by Lava Bird Studios, a game that we actually have covered a couple of times on the channel in demos, streams, and things of the like. It's a game that I was very excited for, a lot of other people were very excited for, and when I first got access to the game and started playing it, I was really enjoying. However, that feeling very quickly soured, and I am now of the opinion, and it is not an uncommon one, that Warside should have been an early access game. However, you can see if you go to this game's Steam page right now, linked in the description, this is considered a fully complete release, charging a normal price for an indie title of this type, despite the fact that the reviews are not very great, and a lot of people in the forums and on Steam community pages are very much not happy. Now, I am not normally someone who is super into Steam reviews. I actually have a lot of very negative things to say about them. However, in this case, things are pretty accurate. At time of recording, the game is currently sitting at a solid mixed reviews, which is not great, not exactly what you want to see. And I've actually been delaying this video in the hope of any updates, but very little has come. Some things have, and we'll talk about that near the end in terms of developer response, but it's looking rough out there right now. So as far as how much of an Advance Wars clone or an Advance Wars like this is, the similarities are pretty obvious if you're at all familiar with that franchise. You build infantry, tanks, mechanized infantry, planes, boats. You take properties that you then gain income from. You can use different terrain to get different defense boosts. Different commanding officers have different abilities, and overall, the art style is very reminiscent of what Advance Wars has done, although still very unique in its own right. You've got a full campaign, a level editor, multiplayer, and the works. And on its face, it looks very, very promising, even for the price tag. However, there's definitely a lot of problems, as you might expect from that mixed review. So, we're going to talk about the positives of the game first, just to let you know that I do actually kind of like this game and would like to see it do better than it is currently doing. Then we will get into the negatives, which is going to be quite a bit more involved, and the negatives will actually be split into two sections. Just the general design negatives that are just, I think, part of the game and nothing that can really be done about it, and then the examples of how the game is very clearly unfinished, and there's a lot of them, and I don't say that lightly because I don't generally like the way that people bandy about accusations of unfinished games. Finally, we'll wrap up with just general critique and discussion of the current messaging from Lava Bird Studios in discussion of the not so stellar response, shall we say, putting it gently, from the fanbase. So, to start off, what are the positives? Well, there are a few people that have very vehemently disagreed with me on this one. I think the pixel art and animations for Warside are very, very strong. Yes, very heavily reminiscent of Advance Wars, but it really brings its own style to the table that very much makes the game feel familiar but unique. I like that the different infantry have a little bit more of a modern military take. Heck, I like that a lot of the tanks and vehicles and planes have a more modern military setting as well. It's not like tactical Call of Duty levels of fiddly bits and gubbins and all that type of fun stuff, but it's still more modern than the Advance Wars games in a way that I feel like Nintendo was probably afraid to push too hard to make things feel a little too realistic. No such concerns here, and as such, with the quality of the pixel animations themselves, everything looks really, really nice. I mean, all the footage that you're going to be seeing over the course of this video, the game looks clean, it looks crisp, and it's very satisfying to watch in motion, which is part of the fun of Advance Wars games for me, and I imagine a lot of people, so big kudos there. Also, Lava Bird added a lot of very interesting new styles of units with their own unique unique mechanics that I never would have even dreamt of in an Advance Wars game, let alone expected to see in the original franchise, but yet which still have a really cool place here and expand your gameplay options in a lot of ways that I really enjoy. One of the most notable things, of course, being the Rhino, not that Rhino, that is able to push units around, deals very little damage, but can potentially shove units into buildings or walls or water and instantly destroy them, to say nothing of the fact that you can just like maneuver enemy formations around and make room for your own guys, bust through lines against an enemy that might be a little too hard to bring down conventionally. It's a cool idea, and it's just one example of all the really interesting different units that have been added in Warside. This is doubled by the fact that there are actually a bunch of faction-specific units in the game, which is something that I do very much enjoy, with each of the 4 factions, supposedly, having a bevy of unique units that fit their overall aesthetic and style. The Blue Army, your starting army, for example, is the army that has things like the Rhino, as well as other heavier tanks for a very classic, heavy mechanized weaponry sort of style, which is very fun. Compare that to the Orange Army, that's focused a lot more on fast attacks, sneak attacks, and the like, which is exemplified by their stealth bikes that have heavy rocket launchers on them, which can do a ton of damage, and which can push through other enemy units to attack the backline, but which of course are also very squishy in response. Every faction does have an identity like this, and their units reflect that, which makes for a lot of fun options that I imagine could be very enjoyable in the multiplayer, except for some of the issues that we're going to talk about in the negative section. But we're talking positives right now, so let's be a little bit chill about it. Of course, as far as general units are concerned, you also have other fun things like the sniper infantry, which function as infantry artillery, which are very interesting. Medics to be able to heal your actual infantry, which is a very nice option to have on the front lines. And one of my personal favorites, the sea-based ribs, that are basically water infantry, just 2 dudes in an inflatable raft that can motor around, do a little bit of skirmishing, and most importantly, capture sea-based buildings like oil rigs for extra income, or even to attack shoreline-based cities to be able to take those from the enemy as well, which is a very nice little option. Makes water units feel a little bit more impactful, at least in the campaign. Of course, we mentioned it briefly with all the different types of units that are available, but there are a bunch of mechanical innovations that I think are very welcome and which I would love to see eventually incorporated into the mainline Advance Wars franchise if Nintendo ever does anything with it again, such as multiple units being able to build per construction facility based on how much HP that facility has, which can really speed up gameplay. The fact that you can instantly capture neutral buildings and then have them build strength over time, rather than having to take multiple turns to whittle them down to only then capture them and be able to use them for your own benefit. The fact that captured buildings can in fact be whittled down by any unit, even if infantry are the only ones that can secure the capture, and the fact that units actually will take damage from this, kind of giving that feeling that you are actually subjugating a city to bring it under your control, and you might lose some tanks or some dudes in the process. Transports can carry multiple units, which is very, very nice and makes a lot of sense, and you can also move transports and then disembark your units, which can then immediately take actions, making transports feel very dynamic and again keeping the combat flowing. Add on to this the fact that different transports do in fact have different things that they can carry, much more expanded from the base Advance Wars series, and you've got a lot of versatility here, and it actually made transports feel very fun to use. Speaking of keeping things from turning into a slog and keeping things moving, units actually need to return to a facility that can produce units of their type to be able to repair. So you can't just bunker down on any city that you have ownership of and keep regenerating health over time. You actually have to consider how far back do I have to retreat a unit before I'm able to bring it repairs. On the flip side, if you have the money, bringing a unit to a building that can build it for repairs will immediately restore that unit to full HP for a roughly equivalent cost. So once you get there, you can get back onto the front line fairly quickly, and if you're staging in an area where you actually have construction facilities, you can keep your army pretty well stocked up as long as you have the funds. So there's a lot of checks and balances here, but again, it keeps things moving, which I very much appreciate. The included CO powers are fun and interesting, giving some unique identity to the cast, even if there's a little bit of a focus on just AoE abilities in a targeted area, but that's kind of just a quirk of the way that the system is set up here. And as mentioned previously, maps with sea tiles have been improved massively with the inclusion of offshore platforms that grant more money than landlocked buildings, which again makes control of the sea very important and makes that avenue of battle all the more interesting, especially with sea-based infantry. As far as other game design decisions that are not mechanical in nature, the music, absolute bop, even though it's third party, which means that I can't play it for you here because apparently they're pretty aggressive about claiming and copyright claiming and striking any video that has their music in it, which is a little bit of a shame. But I mean, watch any of the trailers or anything like that, you'll be able to hear it for yourself. It's quite good. The level editor seems pretty well fleshed out, and I imagine people could make some pretty interesting maps with it. And of course, you do have multiplayer options there. However, this is where we have to start talking about the negatives, and we can kind of lead into that with the discussion of multiplayer. So the negatives, again, we're going to be splitting this into two parts for reasons that will be very shortly apparent. Just go through the things that I just generally don't like first. First of all, there's just an imbalance of unique units for various factions, and this may be something that leans into the second half of this section. But there are certain factions that just have more unique units than others. Like again, the Blue Army has rhinos and they have giant tanks, for example, whereas the Orange Army just has the bikers in terms of unique units. Obviously, they have the full base range of units that they can access, but it immediately feels weird. Then you see the Light Blue faction, the Ice faction, and they apparently have a unique unit. It's mentioned in the campaign, but it never shows up. And then you have the Marauders, the Green faction, and they have a bunch of different unique units. So it's like, why does it feel like different factions are being better served here? Like, is that not just going to create an imbalance of options? And the answer is yes, but that's certainly not the only imbalance here. You also have a different amount of COs per faction, which is not necessarily a bad thing, because like whoever you play is whoever you play, and whatever colors they happen to be wearing is like not a huge deal. But when you consider the fact that yes, you do have different units, or you're supposed to have different units for different factions, it becomes a little bit of a bigger deal if your play options in terms of commanders that can use those units are more limited than a player that's using a different faction, right? It's just not generally a great feeling. You might notice as well that I have been referring to all of the different armies by basically just what color they're represented by, except for the Marauders, because that name is just easy to remember. That's because the writing in this game is pretty bad. And look, Advance Wars is not exactly known for its stellar writing. Days of Ruin does a lot more to flesh out its characters and its world and actually, make you care because it's a more serious situation. But the Advance Wars series is at least known for being kind of like funny and having characters that have a lot of personality. Not the case here in Warside. Not by a long shot. I truly cannot muster an ounce of care for any of these characters, and I cannot remember any of their names, except I think like the main starter guy in the Blue Army is Jackson, and that's it. That's all I've got. I literally just don't care. Whereas I can name off a ton of different COs from Advance Wars, and I haven't even played those games nearly as religiously as a lot of people have. So that's to say nothing of the overall campaign story, which is completely forgettable, literally only exists to have you waging a war across the world. And like when you're in the Advance Wars series and half of it is just like, well, these goofy commanders want to challenge each other for the sake of practicing their military skills. Like, all right, you know what? Fair enough. And then a big bad guy faction shows up and we have to band together and go beat them up. Like, that's fine. This is trying to take itself much more seriously. And so I just am bothered by how little I care. As far as mechanics that are missing, we have no fuel usage whatsoever, even though there's literally a fuel icon on unit menus, and there's literally no representation of ammo anywhere. So refueling and resupplying is never a concern, and so long as you can keep your units healed up, you can keep the same tank on the front lines literally forever. Now, again, this may very well be an intentional design choice, but I still don't like it because having that idea of supply chains and actually making sure that your units are good to go in terms of the gear that they need is a very important factor in any war game, especially a war game like this. So it's a little bit of a weird choice to not include it. I also literally could not find a game to test the multiplayer, which was a little bit of a shame, seeing as how a lot of these games tend to live or die on their multiplayer once you're done with the campaign, and I don't know if it was just a bug or if there was just no one playing or no one playing at the time that I was trying to play, the various different times I was trying to play, but I was literally never able to get into a multiplayer game, and I wasn't even able to try to make a private game with a friend until a major patch came out with some information, shall we say, from the devs, which again we'll get into in a second. So was not able to test that at the time of recording. Finally, there's literally no clear ending for the campaign, i.e. you finish the last mission and events happen and it seems like there should be like a cutscene, dialogue, an epilogue screen, something, and there's literally nothing. It just dumps you back out on the campaign screen, and you're just there. No credits, no nothing. It just stops. Which leads us directly into the section where we talk about all the negatives of the game due to it literally being unfinished. So, need a little bit of a disclaimer here on this one. I hate when people on the internet, when capital G gamers, look at something that they don't like about a game and they accuse it of being unfinished. We saw this a lot with Space Marine 2 when it launched. People talking about how the multiplayer mode was unfinished because it only had 3 maps, or there were not customization options for the Chaos Space Marines, right? Like, the idea of setting up customization for the Chaos Space Marines would have involved so much work that it was not worth doing. Doesn't change the fact that everything was functional. That is not an example of a game being unfinished just because people who are playing it say that it is. This, however, with Warside, is a proper example of a game that is unfinished. So let's talk about some examples, shall we? First of all, as mentioned, the campaign just ends. There are no credits, there is no end of mission dialogue, there's no wrap-up, no epilogue, no you won screen, nothing. And I'm going to get into spoilers for a second here, but I promise you it does not matter. If you're worried about spoilers in Warside, then you are looking for important story beats in a very, very wrong game. So, you go in, you beat up the big bad, you enter his lab, he goes, "Ha-ha," as he twirls his non-existent mustache. "I have set up the bomb to explode so that I can take you down with me." And the kind of jaded, tough as nails Sergeant CO lady is like, "I can disarm it. I will stay behind and do it." And everyone's like, "No, you can't." She's like, "I must. The timer is counting down, but I can fix this." And the general is literally like, "No," as the timer hits 0. And that's it. There was no earth-shattering kaboom. There was no she managed to do it but died in the process. We literally don't know what happened. And it just stops. No closure. No wrap-up. No nothing. So yeah, that's a little bit weird, but how about all the smaller details, right? Well, there are sound effects that clearly should exist and just don't, like any noise for any units moving across the battlefield. Is this a bug that's just making them not play, or do they not actually exist? I don't know, but the fact that they don't play at all makes me concerned that they just don't exist. And there's some other examples of things that should exist and don't that we're about to talk about, which make me think that maybe they just don't exist. For example, there are no animations in the entire snow region, the multiple missions that you play there. I could not figure out why this was. I thought at first that it was some sort of bug because I had actually turned off animations for a little bit to expedite my clearing of the campaign once I realized that I was no longer really having fun with it, and thought, okay, well, maybe I'm just trying to turn them back on, but that toggle doesn't work. So like I restarted the game, that still didn't work. I was like, well, that's weird, but I mean, I gotta get this done, so I'm just gonna keep carrying on. And then we got back to an area that we had background animations for, and suddenly my animations were back, and I could toggle them on and off without any issue, which tells me they just literally didn't let your animations play in the snow region because they didn't have time to make backgrounds for combat animations in that region, which sucks when it's also the introduction of all of your Navy units. Speaking of Navy units, also, when you're in the ice region, you're getting introductions to your ribs and the cruisers and like the other various sea-based units that you have, like different landers and things. And then the game just tosses you your final like battleship equivalent with no fanfare. They don't even tell you that you have it. They're just like, you have access to our whole arsenal now, and you happen to look at your harbor and you're like, oh, I've got like this whole big fancy ship now. How does it work? When did we get this? You didn't show this to me like any other mission where we got a new unit. Okay, I mean, that's weird, but whatever. Things get even weirder once you start noticing that your battle calculations don't quite look right. For example, those bikes that we mentioned earlier for the Orange Army, sometimes they'll deal big damage to vehicles like they're supposed to. Sometimes you'll try to target a vehicle with one of these bikes and they'll deal almost no damage to it and take a whole bunch of damage from it. But if you have them target infantry, which the bikes generally aren't super great against, but can still deal good damage to, they'll deal like 150% damage and nuke them from orbit, which is odd And this will happen even if you have like multiple bikes on the field. Some of them will just deal more or less damage, and I'm pretty sure this was happening with other units as well. So I don't know what weird bug is happening with this, but feels like something that probably should have been caught, because like the whole point of the game is different units being able to deal more or less damage to other units, so that's a problem. Speaking of nuking things from orbit, the previously mentioned Spec Ops lady has a power that's essentially a giant laser airstrike, which maybe seems a little off for her like infantry-based, Black Ops stealthy sort of persona. But, you know, I rationalized it, like, okay, well, yeah, maybe she's, like, the idea is, oh, she can move in and paint the target for the giant laser, and then you can, like, airstrike something. Like, okay, that makes sense. Until you get a bunch of dialogue that implies that she's supposed to have some sort of, like, stealth or invisibility power. Like, when you activate a power, the enemy will be like, oh, I can't believe you're using this ability again. And with her, everyone's like, oh, you're going to pull this disappearing act again. I'm like, disappearing act? Who's disappearing? We're right here. Then you get access to the general of the Blue Army, and he has the exact same CO power, and everything starts to click into place. They literally either just didn't make or didn't get to complete a CO power for this lady and gave her someone else's so she had some sort of power, or there's some sort of bug that is making her power be replaced by his, which is more forgivable. But in a full release where the powers of the different COs is a major function of their characters, absolutely should be something that was caught pretty early on and fixed. Circling back to that final mission for a second that we mentioned, it has a random mechanic where the tower that you're trying to take, which does have a giant brain on it, so like I guess that leans into what we're about to talk about a little bit, but it's not exactly much in the way of foreshadowing, will just mind control random units of yours. This isn't something that is ever mentioned, not discussed, not foreshadowed, not something that has ever been part of the powers of the faction that you are fighting, and literally no one comments on it when it happens. This is so bad that I actually didn't even notice at first that it had happened until I was like, wait, why is a blue ship attacking me? That's my ship. Oh my god, I can't control it. Oh my god, I guess it's mind controlled? What the hell? Why isn't anyone talking about this? And the best part is, even this function is bugged. Because when it happened to the same unit again after, I guess, the status effect wore off, which is not something that I was able to check in any way either, they did it again because it was like my most powerful unit, which, okay, fair enough. Except now every other turn I was still able to control it like normal. So, like, I don't know. Like, the captain and crew on that ship were fighting for their goddamn lives and, like, pushing back against his mind control power to try and eke out some sort of advantage for me, I guess, because they just were half the time my buddies again. So, like, give those guys a medal, but maybe not whoever coded whatever this ability is, yeah? There's dialogue that implies certain missions should happen or are coming up or should have happened previously, and yet those missions never appear, which makes for really bizarre jumps between story missions and makes me wonder if that's where some of the random units that get introduced out of nowhere were actually supposed to be introduced and just didn't, so now we just have these weird gaps in the story. Speaking of not being able to see status effects, there's no place to see descriptions of anything. Unit stats, CO powers, terrain effects, building functions. None of that is anything that you can look at. And when it comes to things like your CO powers, unless it's mentioned directly in the story to give you some sort of a hint about what it does, you just got to figure that out for yourself, man. Like, you get a new CO and she's like, all right, what's your power do? I don't know. I can take a hint from what the name of it is when I look at it in the menu, and that's often enough to get you at least part of the way there, but it would be great to be able to actually look at my powers or my opponent's powers. Except, wait, you don't have to look at your opponent's powers because the AI never uses it. You would be forgiven for thinking that it's only the Blue Army COs who actually have any sort of special power at first, until you start getting access to the other armies and realizing that, yes, the very COs you were just fighting do in fact have powers that you get to use. This is a staple of the Advance Wars franchise, and I'm sure it's something that both players are able to do in multiplayer, because why the hell wouldn't it be? And yet the AI doesn't do it for reasons that I can't even begin to fathom. Again, we have that imbalance of unique units, including the Ice faction that has apparently some sort of like railgun tank that sounds super cool. Maybe you can build it in multiplayer. Again, I couldn't test that, but it doesn't show up in the campaign, even though your guys are like, oh, watch out for the Wolf Fang or whatever it's called, which is a tank with a railgun on it that can hit multiple units in a row, which sounds super dope. But they sure as hell don't have one on the battlefield when the mission starts, and they never build one the entire time that you're fighting them. So, big force shrug on that, I guess. Most map objectives essentially just boil down to destroy all the enemy units, or maybe like if they have a building to take, which admittedly is how a lot of Advance Wars games are as well, but it feels like there's going to be a much wider range of objectives when you first start the game, and just then seems like they didn't have the time to actually develop them or add them to other missions, so things can get pretty stale pretty quick once you're just moving across a map and eliminating things like you're essentially just playing a skirmish map. Speaking of skirmish maps, there's, at time of recording, no way to play a skirmish against any AI locally. Like, you just can't. Not a thing that can be done. Maybe that's going to change. Maybe that's changed in an update by the time this comes out. But made it really hard to test anything since I couldn't get into multiplayer, and there was no way to play against the AI outside of campaigns where they clearly didn't do things they would, I imagine, supposed to be doing. There's also no differences that can be seen in how COs impact their own units. If there's meant to be, which maybe there's not, in which case this would just be a general negative rather than a game is unfinished negative. But if you don't know what I mean, all the different COs in Advance Wars have different impacts on their units. Like, say, Eagle, the flyboy of Green Earth, gives a massive boost to all of his flying units, but has negatives on other units to balance that out. Jess, also of Green Earth, has a massive boost for like transports and supply units and tanks, but other aspects are weaker or just not as good. And you have a lot of different functionality in there. Like, some characters have better movement through terrain, or some characters have better movement through weather. It's ways to flesh them out as characters and make their armies function differently beyond just their CO power. And again, maybe because different factions do have COs with different powers and also have their own unique units, that's kind of the replacement for that, which if so, fair enough. But I think it's a missed opportunity, and I kind of get the feeling that that was probably something that they wanted to do at some point, and now it doesn't exist, and it just feels weird that it doesn't. I mean, hell, man, like, going from a meta perspective, like, beyond all of the different gameplay issues that we're talking about, which I haven't even mentioned all of, I don't have time to mention all of, there's not even, like, Steam achievements. That's something that's being, like, planned to be added after launch. And I personally could not care less about achievements, but even so, I don't think I've ever seen that before. I don't think I've ever seen a Steam game, let alone like a fully fledged indie title that's like charging a fairly reasonable price for a game like this, to not even have achievements is just weird, man. It's just strange. And I mean, the list just goes on and on. I mean, I think you have plenty of examples here of what the issues with Warside are, and again, it's not even all of them. That's just the stuff that I could remember and jotted down as I was playing. So there's a lot of problems, absolutely. Now, that said, as part of the review process, I want to try to give some positive critiques and feedback to be able to help the devs here, because I don't think they're just trying to put out a scam or whatever, and there's actually been messaging from Lavabird Studios and their head talking about some of the issues, or at least implying some of the issues that they ran into over the course of developing the game, which, you know what, that's fair. Things happen all the time, I get that. So, in the vein of good faith, let's talk about a couple of the things that I feel definitely need to be worked on and added to make this feel like a complete package. First of all, the campaign needs to be finished. There's clearly missing missions, there's clearly lacking actual baseline functionality, that things like the CEOs just not using their powers, like that needs to be fixed. You need to have an ending, you need to have mechanics be explained, you need to have more in-depth objectives, you need to have all these different things. Also, the difficulty, something I didn't even mention, doesn't even feel like it does anything, changing different difficulty settings, so like that obviously needs to be an issue that gets fixed. Like, there's a bunch of different functionality and problems with the campaign that need to be squared away. Because if the campaign isn't solid, the majority of people are going to drop the game and never even get around to trying to create maps or play multiplayer. For the game in general, the rest of the units that presumably would have been planned for all these different factions need to be added to the game or made available to their factions or whatever to balance out the offerings on hand to help make all the different factions feel unique. You need to have a place to be able to see all the different stats, all the different functions of the COs. You need to have a dossier system where you can pull up all these different stats and all this different terminology and actually learn. Because presumably there's going to be people who try to play this that have not played an Advance Wars game and so don't have that living experience to draw on when they're looking at things like different terrain or different movement types to kind of figure out what it is that they're dealing with here. You also need to have general functionality like fuel that gets used actually be implemented in the game and not just be an image on a unit's stat screen that you can't even inspect. It just says fuel 80. Cool. What does that mean? Nobody knows, and apparently it doesn't do anything at this point in the game. Finally, I think most importantly, the missing sound effects that actually, describe or give life to various different units moving across various different terrain, for example, need to be added to make the whole product feel like a complete package and help to draw the audience in to what is otherwise a fairly compelling war game, but just has a couple of these rough edges in terms of presentation beyond getting into any of these mechanical things we've been discussing that make it a little bit harder to really immerse yourself in that world. And people who like to play war games and play around with tanks and send them against their opponents to beat them up, that's an important factor for sure. It needs to be done. So having those be added into the game, I think would be a good step towards fleshing everything out in a positive way. Beyond that, just all the various different things that we talked about in terms of missing dialogue or not having animations in the snow region because making it so that there's actually Steam achievements. These are all things that need to be done just to make a complete package. And fortunately, Lavabird has discussed some of this. At time of recording, there's actually a message out from the studio head talking about all the different things that they're planning on adding, all the things that they've been updating, some of the bugs that they've been quashing, which may or may not have been bugs, but, who knows, whatever. So the game is being worked on, and that is definitely a positive here. Because I do think that Warside does have a lot of potential. I really enjoyed the demo when it came out and when we played it, and at first I was enjoying the campaign. There is life here. There is passion here. This is not just shovelware. If it is, it's extremely well done shovelware in terms of its presentation and its feel. It just needs to be complete. We're sitting at 80% right now. We need to get to that 100%. And when we do, I think you're going to have a very good indie Advance Wars that I think really will feed a lot of people who've been feeling very neglected by Nintendo and Intelligent Systems, which is good. So I'm glad to see that the devs are talking about this. I'm glad to see that they're taking the feedback in stride. My concern is that it's already too late. You've got a niche game in an indie market launching to mixed reviews, which is not received well. It has a lot of very legitimate problems. Again, I am a fairly forgiving person when it comes to games. People often criticize me for not being harsh enough on games, especially games that I enjoy. So when I have a game like this that I enjoy and I'm being this harsh on it, that tells you a lot about what you need to know. So I'm glad to see that the devs are working on it. I'm concerned that it won't be enough, however. All told, Warside is a very promising project that for whatever reason was put out before its time. Why it wasn't made an early access title, I cannot even begin to comprehend. Why it wasn't delayed, I have no idea. But the end result is that we have an unfinished, kind of buggy project that no one is going to be happy with, including the devs themselves. Until updates come along, until patches are deployed and features that are currently missing are added, I cannot and will not recommend that you play Warside for yourself, and I highly encourage you, if you're thinking about it right now, to go and watch other coverage, streams, etc. of the game before you put your money where your mouth is, because $25, that ain't cheap. I wish nothing but the best to Lavabird, of course, to the devs. I hope that you're able to pull this thing together, but I cannot in good faith recommend that anyone pick this one up right now. If that changes, if updates do come out and things are made better, I will absolutely make a follow-up video to address that and encourage people to pick the game up if it is worth it to do so. Fingers crossed that that time comes and it does not take long in the arrival. With that said, I'm going to wrap this one up here. Thank you all so much for watching. If you have played Warside for yourself, maybe your thoughts are more positive than mine, or there are issues that I did not address that you want to make sure are addressed, please feel free to put all of that in the comments down below so we can have a good discussion here. If there's a particularly informative group of stuff, I'll make a pinned comment as an addendum to the video, that type of thing. Let me know what your thoughts are, because I definitely would love to hear them, as I'm very disappointed by this release and would like to talk about it with y'all. For now, though, my name has been Tom, otherwise known as Titanium Legman. I hope you all have a good night. Stay safe and healthy out there, everyone. And remember, be good to each other. Bye now.